Last week, we talked about the 10 things that you really shouldn't ask or don't need to ask when you're buying a car. And they weren't just, pet peeve questions that salesmen get because they don't like answering them, but questions that I've found over the couple decades I've been doing this to just be absolutely pointless. You don't need to ask them. They don't get you to where you need to be in buying a car. So this week we're going to follow up and talk about the questions you should ask when you're buying a car. Now, the main point of the questions you don't need to ask was that they are indirect questions. They're operating based off of false assumptions that certain metrics like mileage or number of owners or length of time owning a car speaks to the condition of the car. I have found statistically that there is no correlation, but people operate with false assumptions all the time when they're looking at cars. So we're going to try to address the questions that get directly to the heart of what you actually want to know, which is this car going to be what I'm looking for, what I expect or what I want, and am I going to get the title? Right? That's an important one. The tough part about this, it was way easier to come up with the 10 questions you don't need to ask than to come up with the ones that you do need to ask, because the point is that there really are no silver bullet questions. You could ask 3,000 questions and still get screwed over because somebody either doesn't know how to describe a car properly or they're really good at lying. So there is no substitute for seeing the car in person or having somebody as qualified or more qualified than yourself look at the car as well. And that goes into a whole nother can of worms, like we talked about a few weeks ago regarding pre-purchase inspections and whether or not they have value or where the value lies. There's a lot that goes into buying cars properly, but as a dealer, I used to kind of always get frustrated with the guy who wanted to place a deposit and then fly out and bring his friend and have a pre-purchase inspection done. And I'm like, come on, man, like I'm telling you what the car is. From a buyer's perspective, I think I actually totally respect that person because I think that's the best way to do it. Is you can't trust any one tool exclusively. You can't trust a Carfax. You can't trust a dealer's reputation. You can't trust the questions you ask. You can't trust a PPI. No single tool is effective for making sure you get a good car. You have to use all of the tools in your belt. Without further ado, let's get into some of the questions that are really important to ask, and I'm going to contrast them to the questions we touched on last week that you don't need to ask. So one of the questions was it serviced at a dealer? A better question to ask is, what service records do you have? That is a specific question, and it gets to the heart of the issue, which is, was the car actually properly maintained and taken care of? And do you have proof of that? Service records only go to give an indication of what a car currently is, right? You can have a bad car with a huge stack of service records, and you can have a good car with no records because the person lost them in a fire or in a divorce or whatever. But it is certainly, at least from a distance, a really good tool to get an idea of how the car was maintained. So if you have a good service history file and you can review it before purchase, it's a really good way, without seeing the car, to get an idea of how the car was taken care of. But the important aspect to that question is it's a very specific, direct question with a non-subjective answer, right? If they say, oh, I just have a couple oil changes, then you know your answer. That doesn't mean the car wasn't serviced, but you at least have an idea of what is available for you to review. But if they have a stack of records for the last 20 years, well, that's a quantitative answer, and you know what you're actually looking at and you have something to review. Then following up on that, you need to ask specific maintenance questions. So you wouldn't ask, well, was it serviced? I think just recently I asked a guy about tires on his car and he goes, yeah, I think they're pretty recent. I think they're like 3 or 4 years old. I said, okay, great. Can you check that for me? And so one of the questions leading to that would be, what are the date codes on the tires? Not how recent are they? And so he looked them up, and it turns out they weren't 4 or 5 years old. They were from 2013. So they were 10 years old. So he was going off of memory, but when I pushed for a specific answer to a question that could be quantified, he had to look and verify and find out that the tires were 10 years old. I guess there's a number of assumptions you can take from that. One, it probably probably wasn't driven hard because the tires are 10 years old. 2, the guy didn't service it that much because the tires are 10 years old. 3, it needs tires. I mean, honestly, that's really the only thing you can unequivocally learn from that is it needs tires. The rest, again, are just assumptions, reasonable assumptions, but, you can't assume anything. The guy could have put track tires on it and swapped out the wheels and put these on the shelf for any number of things. So another good question is what exactly was serviced in the last 3 years? Because recent service is far more important than what was done 20 years ago. The car could have had a new engine 20 years ago, and it really doesn't matter unless you're looking at, collector value and you want all matching numbers. But, the new engine 20 years ago doesn't mean a thing if the guy hasn't changed the oil in 19 years, paging Mustang owners. So you want to know specifics. What was done, when, and what was the last service, both mileage and time. Ferrari guys are famous for this because, when you're buying a Ferrari, you want to make sure that the timing belt and tensioners were done. Typically, they are a 3 to 5 year increment depending on the car. And guys are famous for saying, well, it was done within the last 1,000 miles. But Ferraris never get driven. So 1,000 miles ago could have been 10 years ago. And if they tell you the mileage but not the year, that it's way out of range. Specific questions. When, what mileage was the last service? What was done? Who cares where it was done, but what was done? Do you have receipts to prove it? Going down into the nitty-gritty of specifics to try to determine how the car was taken care of, rather than asking roundabout questions that lead to assumptions that don't actually give you an answer to what you want to know. Another big one, does it have a clean Carfax? Now, that's not a question we touched on last week, but it is kind of an irrelevant question. 1, because you can pull your own Carfax, but 2, it doesn't answer the question you actually want the answer to, which is, does it have a history of paintwork or damage repair? There are innumerable cars out on the market that have been painted, have been damaged, that have a perfectly clean Carfax. It could have been damaged on track. It could have been in a parking lot and no police report was filed. Somebody didn't want it to be on Carfax or didn't want a ding on their insurance, so they paid it out of pocket. It was done at a dealership in the lot, and of course, they're not going to want to file an insurance claim, so they just fix it in their own body shop. Thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of cars out there with paintwork or damage repair, anywhere from major to minor, that doesn't show up on Carfax. So you want to ask specifically, is there any history of paintwork or damage repair, either during your ownership or prior? Now, that's a tough one with private owners because a lot of them just don't know how to call it. And if they bought the car from somebody else, they probably didn't ask that question. They just got a Carfax and figured it was good. It's at least a specific question, and you're forcing the seller to tell the truth or lie blatantly. I think it's a lot easier for sellers to omit things that are negative than to lie outright. So a lot of people operate under the assumption that if you don't ask, that it's not their responsibility to tell you. And that certainly does go along with the principle of caveat emptor. It is the buyer's responsibility to verify what they need to know on a car before they make a purchase. But there are some laws governing dealers in some states and maybe even private parties regarding disclosure of prior damage, especially significant damage and or paintwork. So if you ask them the question, you're forcing them to make an ethical decision. Say, am I actually going to bold-faced lie about this, or am I going to tell the truth? And that's, I think it's a lot harder for people to lie outright than to just omit things. So get down to the nitty-gritty of things. Force people to answer direct questions about the condition of the car. All right, next, one of the questions last week that you don't need to ask, where is the car from? The better question, yes, you do want to know where the car is from, but you can't just assume the condition based on that. What you want to know is, where is the car from and how is the car stored? Because if it's from a southern climate, you want to know if it was stored in an air-conditioned garage, because heat can kill a car. If it's from a northern climate, you want to know, did it see salty roads? And that's really what people want to know when they ask that question. Well, is the car from Ohio? Yes. Oh, it must be rusty. Well, why don't you just ask me if it's friggin' rusty? The better question is, how was the car stored? And was it driven in certain XYZ weather? If somebody's fastidious about storing their car and they live in Canada and they store it for the winter, it's probably way, way nicer than a car from Florida that never saw salty roads but was stored outside all of its life, because a lot of people down there don't have garages because, well, It doesn't snow. It doesn't get that cold. I'll just park my car outside in a carport. Yeah, and the paint gets eaten up. Again, specific questions to get to the heart of what you want to know. Another question from last week that you don't need to ask: how long has it been for sale? I think a better question is, how long have you owned it? This goes back to our guy with the 996 GT3 because he had only owned it 2 months. What I'm getting at is not what I think most people think. Most people want to know how long somebody's owned it because they assume that if you're selling it after a short period of time, that it's a hot potato game, that you're trying to get away from a problem. That's not necessarily the case, especially with high-end luxury cars that are toys. People change their mind, they buy a car they don't like, they get married, whatever. Asking how long you've owned it allows you to establish how well they know the car. Because if they've only owned it 2 months, whatever other question you ask them is kind of going to be irrelevant because they don't know the answer. It's like, well, has a car ever been tracked? Well, I don't know. I've only had it 2 months. I mean, I've asked people that too. I've had people make unequivocal statements that a car has never been tracked, that they've owned for a year out of its 12 years of life. And I'm like, did you interview all the other owners? Like, how can you make that statement? You can say it's never been tracked during my ownership, but you don't know about the past unless you actually know the owners. Knowing how long somebody's had the car establishes their depth of knowledge about the car, and then that determines what questions, what value their answers are going to have to your questions. If they've owned it a month, it's like, well, pointless asking you any questions. Give me the phone number of the last guy. Another question we asked, or that you don't need to ask, that we addressed last week is it on consignment? The better question is, what is the title status? Now, this could be true with a private party or with a dealer, because if a dealer has a car on consignment, it could be a clear title with the owner. The owner could have it. The dealer could have it. Is it signed off to the dealer? In a private party, you need to determine if there's a payoff or if they have clear title. And then you need to dig deeper as well. It's a good idea to get a copy of the title, run the title number, call their local state's title bureau, DMV, whatever. Make sure there's no recent liens on the title, because Carfax has a pretty good delay on information being reported. I think I checked Carfax on a car we had bought like 2 or 3 weeks after we had titled it in our name, and it still didn't show up on Carfax. So somebody could get a duplicate title, file a lien on a title, and it's not on Carfax, and you won't know about it. Determining the current status of the title is very important. And then, of course, if there is a payoff, determining what the steps are to perfect the lien, to pay it off, and make sure that your interests are covered and the title doesn't end up, with a dealer who's going to hold on to it and, maybe leverage the funds or whatnot. So you need to know what the title status is, and that's more complex than just running a Carfax and getting a copy of the title. You should really do some additional digging. Next question, why are you selling it? The better question, because I think the assumption from that question is that there's something wrong with the car. So why don't you just ask, are there any specific things that do not work on the car? Or what is currently wrong with the car? What currently needs addressed? Now, that doesn't mean somebody won't lie to you. All these questions assume that there's a modicum of truth or ethics, with the seller and what they're going to tell you. And you can't get around people just bold-faced lying. We're assuming that people are going to answer the questions you ask them. Asking them directly, what doesn't work on the car? What does the car need? Does the car need tires? And again, this goes back to other things. When was the last service? Because you could say, what does a car need? They say, well, nothing. Okay, cool. Well, when was the last oil change? 4 years ago. Okay, so it needs an oil change. So then you, again, take them down this trail of making them address specific issues and getting to the bottom of what you actually want to know. Don't ask why they're selling it, because that's an assumption. Ask what you actually want to know. Another question from last week that you don't need to ask is, how old was the owner? A better question is, what other cars have you owned? Or something like that, to basically get to know the owner. Who cares how old they are? You want to know their experience with cars, because a young guy could have a ton of experience, could have gone to mechanic school, could really know his way around cars. An old guy could, just be a rich guy that has a bunch of cars and just got into cars 2 years ago and bought them from the local dealer and has no friggin' idea what he's doing. There's a saying Buy the owner, not the car. I don't think I actually agree with this statement. I kind of go back and forth on it based on what that statement is actually saying, because there's some terrible owners that have no clue, but that have really good cars that they just accidentally fell into. And then there's a lot of owners who think they're really great at taking care of cars because they, armor all the dash all the time and stuff like that. So there's people who have an unrealistic sense of their own ability or inability to care for a car properly. You can ask specific questions, again, specific to try to judge the quality of the owner to see whether or not they really know how to care for a car. And it's a crapshoot too, and I've totally gotten this wrong. I bought a BMW M3 for my wife, and I bought it from a guy down in North Carolina. Again, I was shopping region because, a car that's lived in North Carolina, it was not near the coast, then it's never had a chance to be exposed to salt, so it can't be rusty. I was right there, but it wasn't stored properly. It had water spots and etching all over the paint. And the guy, even though he was an engineer and was very detailed and talked about all sorts of specific things in detail, he never friggin' serviced the car. And I got it back, and it blew a head gasket, and it needed a new top, and man, I talked to him for hours, and I thought I had him pegged as this guy is detailed and knows what he's doing, especially because he's an engineer. And he even told me the story about how there was a little bit of paint work in the lower door because when he was in the parking lot, he accidentally shot his gun through the door.
Oops.
And he was super embarrassed about it. And sure enough, I found the little hole where they had repaired the leather trim at the bottom of the door. And yeah, he was honest about that. But again, he didn't know what taking good care of a car meant, and I misjudged his character totally and made the assumption that because he was an engineer that he was also good mechanically, which was a bad assumption. And the final question that you don't need to ask is, what's your bottom line, right? So once you've determined that this is the car for you and you want to try to buy it, now it becomes a matter of landing on the right price. What questions can you ask to get the right price? I think a better tactic, at least from a seller's perspective, I'd rather just have somebody make an offer, because then I know if they're completely smoking crack and wasting my time or if they're really interested in the car. But at least I know they're trying to buy this car and they want this car, and then we can commence negotiations from there. But if you want to feel out the seller, because some sellers will take it really personally if you lowball them, and everybody's definition of lowball is different. There's a guy asking $15,000 for a Honda S2000 one time. I offered him $12,500, and you would have thought I called his wife, fat and ugly. Like, he was so pissed. I didn't think that was a lowball, but to him it was. So a better question, instead of what's your bottom line, would be, are you open to offers? And I think that's a better question than are you negotiable, or how negotiable are you? Because how negotiable are you, again, is getting into the realm of non-specifics. It's a relative question. Nobody knows how negotiable are you. What does that even mean? So the better question is, are you open to offers? Because if they're firm and they'll say no. But you want sellers to answer things in the affirmative, right? That's an old sales tactic. You want to ask questions that have a positive answer. So if you can get them to say yes, even though it's a negative thing for them that they're coming off their price, that opens you up to say, okay, great, you are negotiable. Then you can go in and say, here's where I'm looking to be in terms of price. Don't ask what your bottom line is. A lot of people don't know. Ask, are you open to offers? And then friggin' make an offer if it's the right car for you. There you go. There's some of the questions you really should ask when you're buying a car. Some of the reasons why you should ask it. Again, ask specific questions to get to the bottom of what you actually want to know. Don't ask indirect questions. Go look at the car yourself. Have some help. Have some expert eyes. Use every resource available to you possible. Even then, it's still pretty much a crapshoot. You have about a 80% chance of success. So
cross your fingers and good luck.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Buying cars is a crapshoot. I've bought, a few thousand cars over my lifetime, and I miss a lot. It happens. And sometimes they're little misses, like I a little bit overpaid, or I, didn't realize this was scraped, or thought the car was going to be a little bit nicer. And sometimes they're huge misses. But the fewer cars you buy, the more careful you want to be, because you can't absorb it. Dealers can afford to miss 1 out of 10 times because they can absorb it with the other 9. But if this is your dream car and the only car you're going to buy for 10 years, you can't afford to get scammed. So make sure you do all of your homework. And if you're not sure what it is, ask somebody, hire an expert. I'm available. Consulting work.
That wasn't on my list of ads. Oh.